The morning Cassian Doe walked out of that courtroom, he was wearing the same boots he'd worn to his wife's funeral 14 months earlier. Nobody noticed that. They noticed the flannel shirt, the work-worn jacket, the fact that he hadn't shaved in 4 days. His father-in-law's attorney, a man named Prescott who billed at $900 an hour and made sure everyone in the room knew it, had glanced at Cassian exactly once during the 3-hour proceeding and then looked away. The kind of look you give a piece of furniture that's in the wrong room. That was fine. Cassian had spent most of his adult life being underestimated by men in good suits. He'd stopped being bothered by it somewhere around age 32. He was 39 now, and he had bigger things to think about. He thought about his daughter. Her name was Rosie, and she was 6 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, pale gray, the color of fog over still water. And she was the only reason Cassian had gotten out of bed every morning for the past 14 months without screaming. The hearing that day was supposed to be simple. A custody modification filing, brought by Vivienne's parents, the Aldermans. They wanted to revisit the arrangement that had been set up shortly after their daughter's death, when Cassian was still barely functioning and had agreed to let Rosie spend 3 weeks every month in Maplewood, at their estate, while he got back on his feet. That arrangement had been temporary. Everyone agreed it was temporary now. Apparently, everyone did not agree. Prescott had spent 40 minutes laying out a very composed, very expensive argument for why Rosie would be better served living primarily with the Aldermans. He used phrases like stability of environment and educational continuity and documented emotional instability in the paternal home. That last one had required Cassian to press his thumb hard into his palm under the table just to keep his face still. Documented emotional instability. He'd cried at Vivienne's funeral. He'd cried again in March, on what would have been her 38th birthday, when Rosie had asked him if Mama could see them from heaven, and he hadn't known what to say. He'd called his sister at midnight once, in December, and she'd talked to him for 2 hours about nothing in particular, until he could breathe again. That was the documentation. His attorney, a woman named Quinn Aldrich, no relation, the irony was not lost on him, had pushed back carefully, point by point. She was good, she was thorough. But Cassian had watched the Aldermans' faces across the table, and he had seen something there that Quinn's thoroughness couldn't touch. They were certain, the kind of certain that comes from having always gotten what they wanted, in every room they'd ever walked into. Gerald Alderman was 71 years old, and had made his money in commercial real estate before flipping into private equity. He wore his wealth the way some men wear cologne, pervasive, slightly suffocating, applied in the belief that more was always better. His wife, Marguerite, sat beside him with her hands folded, a silk blouse the color of cream, and she looked at Cassian the way she'd always looked at him. Like a temporary condition her daughter had contracted and eventually recovered from, only the recovery had taken a tragic turn. They had loved Vivienne. Cassian had never doubted that. But loving someone and understanding them were different things, and Vivienne had understood that better than anyone. She'd spent most of her adult life quietly, doing things her parents didn't quite understand and didn't quite approve of. Marrying Cassian had been one of them. He'd met her at a land restoration conference in Bozeman, Montana, of all places. She was there, representing a nonprofit she'd helped found. He was there because he'd been invited to speak on sustainable watershed management, which was the kind of sentence that made people's eyes glaze over at parties, but which Vivienne had met with genuine, focused, slightly intense curiosity. They'd talked for 4 hours. He'd called his sister the next morning and said, entirely unplanned, "I think I'm going to marry this woman." He had. They'd had 7 years, and Rosie, and a house they'd renovated board by board in Eastern Oregon. And then Vivienne had gone to a routine follow-up appointment in February of last year, and they'd found something that shouldn't have been there. And 9 months later she was gone. He still hadn't moved any of her books. The judge that morning had been a careful man named Harlow, mid-50s, wire-rimmed glasses, the demeanor of someone who had heard every variety of human misery and had made peace with not being able to fix most of it. He'd listened to both sides with equal stillness, made a few notes, and then recessed for 20 minutes. When he came back, he said the matter would require additional review given the complexity of the custody history, and scheduled a formal hearing for 6 weeks out. Which meant nothing had been decided. Which meant Prescott, and Gerald Alderman shook hands in the hallway, with the quiet satisfaction of men who believed delay was the same as winning, because they could afford to wait, and assumed Cassian could not. Prescott paused near the exit and said something to his assistant that Cassian wasn't meant to hear but did anyway. "We'll have the girl by Thanksgiving." Cassian walked out of the courthouse into cold October air and stood on the steps for a moment. The sky was the particular flat gray of a Pacific Northwest morning that can't decide whether it's going to rain or not. A woman was sitting on a bench across the street, a child of about 3 on her lap, feeding pigeons with single-minded delight. The woman was watching the child, not the birds. Her whole face was in it. He thought about Rosie. He took out his phone and sent a text to his sister that said, 6 more weeks. Still standing. Going to get her from school now. His sister's response came back in 11 seconds. "That's the only thing that matters. Go get your kid." He went and got his kid. What Prescott did not know, what Gerald Alderman did not know, what essentially no one in that courtroom that morning knew, was that 3 years earlier Cassian Doe had quietly sold a company. It hadn't been loud, the selling of it. That was partly by design and partly just because of who Cassian was. He wasn't built for announcements. The company had started as a water rights consulting firm he'd launched with 2 colleagues after leaving his position at the EPA. A small, unglamorous, technically specific operation that spent its first 4 years barely breaking even, and its 5th year landing a federal infrastructure contract that changed everything. They'd grown from 7 employees to 63. They'd been acquired by a Pacific-based environmental engineering group called Latham Terra in a deal that Cassian's attorney at the time had described, with admirable restraint, as extremely favorable. Cassian had retained a significant equity stake in the acquiring company and a seat on its advisory board, which he'd held quietly for the past 3 years, while running a much smaller watershed restoration project out of eastern Oregon, which was the thing he'd actually always wanted to do. The money existed. It was simply not visible in the way the alderman's money was visible. There was no estate. There was the house, the one he and Vivian had rebuilt, on 12 acres with a river running through the back of it. There was a truck that was 8 years old because he'd never seen a reason to replace something that worked. There was a barn that currently housed 4 orphaned elk and an argument-prone border collie named Gus, because Rosie had decided that was what the barn should be for, and Cassian had not found a compelling counterargument. He had not hidden any of this. He simply hadn't announced it, because he'd never been the kind of man who led with his net worth in a conversation, and also because it genuinely hadn't occurred to him that it would be relevant. It became relevant. The person who made it relevant was not Cassian. Her name was Della Voss, and she was 37 years old. And she was the new attorney Quinn had brought into second upcoming formal hearing. Because Quinn, to her credit, had looked at the alderman's legal team and decided she wanted backup. Della had spent 10 years in family law before burning out completely, moving to Portland, and spending 18 months consulting for a nonprofit that did legal advocacy for low-income parents in custody disputes. Then she'd come back to private practice, specifically for cases that made her feel like the outcome mattered. Quinn had described her as thorough to the point of being slightly alarming, which Cassian had found reassuring. She called him on a Thursday evening, introduced herself in exactly 4 sentences, and said, "I need to go through your financial history for the past 5 years. All of it. Not because I'm judging it, because the other side is about to." He'd said, "Okay." She'd said, "When I say all of it, I mean all of it." He'd said, "I understood what you meant." There was a pause. Then she said, "Most people don't like this part." "I'm not most people," he said. "When do you want to start?" They started the following Monday via video call, because Della was in Portland and Cassian was in Baker County, and driving 3 hours to look at spreadsheets together seemed unnecessary. She was methodical. She asked questions in the precise way of someone who already knew what the answers probably were and was checking for inconsistencies rather than information. He answered everything directly, without editorializing. After the second session, she said, "You know the alderman's attorney has already requested a financial disclosure order." Quinn told me. "Are you prepared for what happens when they actually look at it?" He leaned back in his chair. Through the window behind his desk, he could see the river, low and copper-colored in the late afternoon. Rosie was outside somewhere, with Gus. He could hear her laughing at something the sound carried. "Yeah," he said. "I'm prepared." Another pause, different from the first. "Mr. Doe, Cassian." She said it like she was filing it away. "Why didn't you mention the Latham Terra sale when you first retained Quinn?" She didn't ask. She should have asked. "Yes," he agreed. "She should have." A long pause. "Okay," Della said. "I'm going to need everything. The acquisition documents, the equity agreements, the advisory board records. All of it. I'll have it to you by Thursday." "Thursday," he said. She'd expected to spend 2 hours on the documents. She spent 6. Not because they were complicated. They were actually very clean, very well organized, the financial records of a man who'd clearly worked with good accountants and had no interest in doing anything clever. It was just that the more she read, the more she understood what was actually looking at, and what she was looking at was a picture that was almost exactly opposite to the one the aldermans had been constructing. They'd built an image of Cassian Doe as a struggling, emotionally fragile, financially precarious widower who'd gotten lucky with temporary custody arrangements and couldn't provide the kind of stable, resource-rich environment a child deserved. It was not a malicious fiction exactly, more a version of events assembled from carefully selected details that, individually, were all technically true. The flannel shirt, the old truck, the barn full of animals. The fact that he drove Rosie to school himself every morning rather than hiring a driver or enrolling her in a school with a transport service. The 2 weeks in December when he'd been so low he'd barely left the house, which an alderman family friend, who lived nearby, had apparently been keeping notes on. All of it assembled into a portrait of a man who was grieving and barely managing, and probably meant well, but clearly needed help. What the financial documents showed was a man who had, 3 years ago, sold a controlling interest in a water resources company for a figure that had caused Della to look at it twice and then close her laptop for 60 seconds and think about something else before she came back to it. She called Quinn that night. "Did you know?" she asked. "I knew he'd sold a company. I didn't know the specifics, Quinn. I know. A pause. "Is it enough?" "It's more than enough. It's not even the point." She pushed back from her kitchen table and walked to her window. The city outside was doing its usual thing. Lights, movement, the low indifferent hum of Portland at 9 p.m. The point is the aldermans are going to walk into that courtroom thinking they have a struggling widower on the ropes. And they are going to find out very quickly that they don't. "Good," Quinn said. "It's better than good," Della said. "It completely reframes everything. The instability argument collapses. The resources argument collapses. All they're left with is preference, and preference is not a legal basis for modifying custody. How do you want to play it?" Della thought about the documents. She thought about the Thursday call, Cassian saying Thursday, without hesitation when she'd pushed back the deadline. She thought about what she'd found buried in the Latham Terra advisory board records. Not financial, the other thing, the reason he'd gotten onto the board in the first place. The project he'd been running for the past 2 years on land he owned. The one that had apparently produced a methodology that 3 different university research groups had published papers citing. She thought about Rosie, whom she hadn't met but felt she knew from the case file. A 6-year-old, who liked elk and a bad-tempered border collie and had her mother's eyes, according to a note Cassian had included, unprompted in the background document he'd sent over. Most parents in Della's experience listed their children's ages and school performance. Cassian had listed her favorite book, the thing she said every time she saw the river in the morning, and the fact that she had recently decided that her stuffed rabbit needed a middle name. She'd included all of it in her notes. She hadn't been sure why. She was starting to understand why. "We let them open with their argument," Della said. "We let Prescott do the whole thing. We don't interrupt. We don't signal anything. And then we show them what they missed." The formal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in November, and it was raining. Cassian arrived early, alone, which confused the alderman's camp, because the previous hearing he'd arrived with his sister and her husband, and people in distress usually brought more people the second time, not fewer. He was wearing a jacket that was neither better nor worse than the one he'd worn in October. He got coffee from the machine in the hallway, found the right courtroom, and sat down. Quinn came in 4 minutes later. Della 2 minutes after that. He'd met her in person twice before. Once at Quinn's office, once at a coffee place in Baker City when she'd driven out to do a site visit, which had been her idea. She'd walked the property for 2 hours, looked at the river, looked at the barn, looked at the house, asked Rosie 11 questions and listened to every single answer. Rosie had shown her the rabbit with the new middle name. Della had said with complete seriousness, "That's a good middle name," and Rosie had said with equal seriousness, "I know." Now Della set her bag down at the table, opened it, and laid out 3 folders with the efficient movements of someone who had done this 10,000 times and had stopped being nervous about it several thousand times ago. She looked at Cassian once. He looked back. She gave a single small nod and looked away. The aldermans came in with Prescott and a second attorney Cassian hadn't seen before, plus a woman he recognized as an education consultant they'd apparently retained. Gerald Alderman glanced at Cassian as he passed. His expression was the same as it had always been. Not unkind exactly, but settled. Certain, Judge Harlow took his seat, reviewed his notes, and nodded to Prescott to begin. Prescott was, Cassian had to admit, very good at his job. The opening argument was clear, structured, and emotionally calibrated. Sympathetic to the aldermans without being overtly manipulative, positioned entirely around Rosie's well-being, rather than their preferences, which was smart. He talked about resources. He talked about community. He talked about the documented period of emotional difficulty in the paternal home. He talked about continuity of grief support, which was a phrase that made Cassian's jaw tighten, but he kept his eyes still and his hands on the table. The education consultant gave a 7-minute statement about educational opportunities in Maplewood versus Baker County, which was thorough, accurate in its facts, and entirely missing the point. Prescott closed by saying that the aldermen sought only what was best for their granddaughter, which was true, and that what was best was a primary residence with them, which was not. When he finished, Judge Harlow looked to Quinn and Della. Della stood up. She thanked the court. She thanked opposing counsel for their thoroughness, and then she set a single document on the table in front of her. Not a folder, just one document, a few pages clipped together, and she said, in the same unhurried way she did everything, "Your Honor, I'd like to start with a clarification, because I think it will help contextualize everything that follows." Prescott looked at the document. Gerald Alderman looked at the document. The opposing counsel has characterized Mr. Doe's home as an environment of financial precarity and limited resources, Della said. I understand why that characterization might seem reasonable from the outside. I want to offer some additional context. She walked through it cleanly, not dramatically. That wasn't her style, and it wouldn't have fit Cassian's either, just clearly. The consulting firm, the growth, the federal contracts, the acquisition, the equity stake, the advisory board work, the methodology that had been cited in peer-reviewed research, the 12 acres, the river. She did it in 11 minutes. By minute 4, Prescott had very carefully shifted his posture. By minute 7, he'd written something on his notepad. By minute 11, he was looking at Gerald Alderman with an expression that was not quite readable from across the room. But Cassian had spent most of his life reading rooms, and what he read was, "You didn't tell me." Gerald Alderman was looking at the table. Marguerite Alderman was very still. Della set down the document. She picked up the second folder. "I'd also like to address the question of stability," she said, "because I think it's been framed in a way that deserves a different perspective." She talked about what stability actually looked like in Cassian's home. Not the absence of grief. She didn't pretend the grief wasn't real, or that the hard December hadn't happened, because it had, and it was documented, and she wasn't going to fight documentation with denial. She said, instead, that grief in the presence of consistent love was not instability. It was honesty. It was a parent who showed his child that loss was real and survivable, rather than a thing to be managed away. She talked about Rosie's school, where Cassian knew every teacher by name and had twice volunteered in the classroom, because Rosie had asked him to and he'd said yes. She talked about the 12 acres and the river, and what Rosie had said during Della's site visit when she'd been asked what her favorite thing about home was. Rosie had thought about it for a while, really thought about it, the way 6-year-olds do when they're taking a question seriously. And then she'd said, "When Daddy makes breakfast and the deer come to the fence, because it's quiet and then it isn't, and I like both parts." Judge Harlow wrote something down. Della talked for 22 minutes total. When she finished, she sat down. There was a particular kind of silence that follows something that has shifted the weight in a room, and this was that silence. Prescott looked at his notes. Gerald Alderman looked at nothing. Marguerite's hands, which had been folded in her lap the entire time, were now pressed flat against the table, and she was looking at Cassian, and her expression was something he hadn't expected. Not anger, not defeat, but something more complicated. Something that looked, unexpectedly, like recognition. She had loved Vivienne. He had never doubted that, and Vivienne had been, in the end, more like her father in temperament than anyone had wanted to admit. Private, methodical, someone who built things quietly and didn't announce them. Maybe Marguerite was only just now seeing that Cassian had been built from the same blueprint as the woman they'd both lost. He didn't know. He'd probably never know. He looked away. Judge Harlow did not rule from the bench that day. He took the matter under advisement, which was expected. He ruled 11 days later. The modification request was denied. Primary custody remained with Cassian. Grandparental visitation was formalized at a schedule that was generous but bounded. Holidays 1 month in summer, alternating spring breaks, and included, at Della's suggestion, a clause requiring that any future modification requests go through mediation first. Quinn called Cassian with the ruling. He was outside when she called, splitting wood behind the barn. He set down the axe, listened to her read the relevant section, said thank you twice, and then sat down on the chopping block and didn't move for several minutes. He wasn't thinking about Prescott, or the aldermans, or the number in the acquisition documents, or the 11 minutes that had apparently reframed everything. He was thinking about Vivienne. He was thinking about a thing she'd said to him once, early on. When he'd been frustrated about something he couldn't change. He couldn't even remember what now, something small, and she'd said, with the matter-of-fact gentleness that had been entirely hers, "You don't have to be loud to be real, Cass. You just have to keep showing up." He'd kept showing up. He went inside and made grilled cheese, because it was Rosie's favorite. And when she got home from school, and dropped her backpack in the hallway and came into the kitchen already talking about something that had happened with her friend Junie at recess, he handed her a plate and listened to the whole story. Really listened, not the half-listening of someone whose mind is elsewhere. And she ate standing up, the way she always did, one foot tucked behind the other knee like a small pink flamingo, and Gus sat under the table, hoping for dropped crumbs, and the river was visible through the kitchen window, low and copper-colored in the November afternoon. He didn't tell her about the ruling that night. She was 6. She didn't know there'd been anything to rule on, not really. She knew she went to Grandma and Grandpa's house sometimes, and she knew she lived here. And as far as she was concerned, those were just the facts of her particular life. He'd tell her when she was older. He'd tell her about the courtroom, and Della's 11 minutes, and the judge's careful words. He'd tell her about the December he'd barely gotten through, and how he had gotten through it, and why. He'd tell her about her mother. All of it, not the curated version, the real version, the one where Vivienne was funny and stubborn, and occasionally wrong, and deeply, completely, irreplaceably herself. He'd tell her that her mother had built something that outlasted her, and that the size of it wasn't measured in anything you could write in a document. That was for later. Tonight, Rosie finished her grilled cheese, announced that she needed to check on the elk, and put on her boots with the focused intensity of a person who has important responsibilities. Cassian watched her go. The border collie scrambled after her, sliding on the kitchen floor, crashing into the doorframe with the shameless enthusiasm of a dog who never learned and never would. Outside, Rosie laughed at something, probably Gus, and the sound of it came through the kitchen window, clear and unhurried, the way the river sounds in the early morning before everything else starts up. He washed the plates. He started thinking about dinner. The river caught the last of the afternoon light and held it for a moment, copper going briefly gold, and then the clouds shifted, and it was just water again, moving the way it always moved, without announcement, without asking permission, going where it had always been going.